Welcome to Boutique Connect Update with me, Joanne Bainham. Today I'm joined by currency partners Sephora Emery and Lauren Walker, talking to us about currency markets. So Lauren, what is Currency Partners seeing in the market in terms of South African residents moving funds abroad?
Well, it's been a busy few years, especially since our COVID experience in 2020. In 2021, we saw 160 billion rand moving out of South Africa under the South African residence allowances. So that's the single discretionary, the 1 million in a calendar year, and the foreign investment allowance or foreign capital allowance, the 10 million per year. What's interesting is that in 2021, we forget, but the dollar rand was at 14.37, which is hard to even comprehend. In 2022 and 2023, we saw roughly 138 billion, 140 billion leaving the country under those same allowances. But if you look back at what the dollar's done over this period, in 2022, it was sitting at about 16.50 on average for the year, and the dollar rand last year was an average of 18.40. So you're seeing it slowly depreciating year on year, but those volumes are still consistent. This year as a start, it's been incredibly busy. And we see this year so far, the average dollar rand has been in 18.90. Yeah, so we have a lot of conversations with our partners in the wealth space around what is a good rate now. And in 2 years ago, people would never have executed at a rate of even 18. And now we're seeing that most our wealth partners are very comfortable if they're getting under 19, because the benefit of having exposure offshore is more than worrying about the exchange rate long term. And so that's kind of the sentiment. So now the question is, today we're sitting at 19 to the rand on the dollar, and is that now a good rate? That's really where we are. So it's been an interesting journey for us, seeing the psychology change over the last few years, but we're not seeing the flows slowing down, and this year in particular, it's been incredibly busy in the wealth space.
And when you say flows, there's the million rand, there's a 10 million rand allowance, and a million rand, now let's help the math here, is like $50,000.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of money.
Yeah.
Are people really bothering with that?
They do. I think they do both. So traditionally you'll see they'll do the discretionary allowance first, the million rand, and then they'll obtain the AIT or tax clearance and then do the balance. It really depends on the client, I suppose, the advisor themselves and their target market and how they handle it, and also the diversification of where it's going offshore. That also matters. But yes, they are. I think what we're seeing in the market is that clients are asking for offshore, and a lot of wealth companies are making it easier now to invest offshore. And so it's becoming more and more popular, and the demand is increasing, which obviously we're very happy with. But you see that shift everywhere in every business.
Sephora, can you just explain to us how South African residents can move money abroad? What kind of rules apply? What rules and regulation do we need to think about?
Yes, certainly. So South African residents have quite a few valuable financial allowances available to them, and that's all within the framework of the South African Reserve Bank. So very similar to what Lauren mentioned now, we'll start with the single discretionary allowance. South African residents are permitted to transfer up to 1 million rand per calendar year abroad. And fun fact about that is your Netflix subscriptions and your Amazon online shopping actually falls under your single discretionary allowance.
It's amazing how many people don't know that.
Yes.
It is quite frightening actually, because from what I understand, they can actually, if you go over that million rand because of a Netflix, they can penalize you.
Yes. So we often get to the end of the year in December where clients are trying to do their discretionary allowance or finish what they think is available, but because they've traveled offshore and you're shopping in Paris, that all affects your single discretionary allowance. So what the challenges come to the end of the year is you have insufficient capacity on your discretionary allowance. So that's naturally an issue for a lot of South African residents, but it's quite an interesting fact that does count against your discretionary allowance.
I was thinking, what would it cost a family of 4 to go to Europe
exactly,
for 3 weeks?
Exactly.
It's going to cost you probably north of 340,000 rand.
Yes.
There's not a lot of SDA left
yes,
after that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you have the foreign capital allowance. So that is the 10 million rand per calendar year, that South African residents can invest abroad. And what that allows residents to do is diversify their portfolio and seize international opportunities. To utilize that allowance though, you will need a valid approval for international transfer tax clearance PIN, which you would get from SARS.
Has it become more difficult though? Was it easier in the past? Has it become more difficult now? Just talk us through that.
Definitely. So, I mean, we had significant changes in the tax clearance process in 2023. And even though it's somewhat of a simplified process now, so what SARS actually did was consolidate the immigration tax clearance PIN with the foreign investment allowance PIN. And now they've integrated that into a very streamlined process for residents and non-residents, and they're calling it the approval for international transfer, commonly known as the AIT PIN. So we've had some noteworthy changes with that, and in my perspective, I can say that SARS is looking for a more global view of the taxpayer's profile. And what they're asking for notably is, four points that I can mention would be statements of assets and liabilities, and they're looking for that categorized into local and foreign assets. They're also wanting to know from the taxpayer if they are indirect or direct shareholders of any legal entities of 20% or more. They're also looking for confirmation of their tax residency status, and that's of course to share, with other countries around the world, and if they are beneficiaries of local or foreign trusts. So we've seen some significant changes in the tax space, and again, my perspective of that is, SARS is trying to get more information, but in the long run, make it easier for the client to apply for any clearances.
All right, so with a single discretionary allowance, I can spend on holidays, I can do whatever I want with the money. Are there any rules around the other money, the 10 million rand allowance?
Yes.
The one that you gave a great term to, which I now forgot. So the 10 million rand allowance, can I go and spend that at Euro Disney, or do I have to go put it into investment?
All within the framework of the South African Reserve Bank. How it works currently, and it's the foreign capital allowance, which is the 10 million rand, and you would need an AIT from SARS in order to utilize your 10 million rand. That would have to go into an investment portfolio in your own name or into an investment offshore. The only way that you would be able to send it, and these are recent changes coming from the SARB, where they've actually relaxed some exchange control regulations, would be with your special approval, and they're now allowing residents to transfer that into a non-resident trust. So your special approval means anything over your 11 million rand for the calendar year, and that is including your SDA and your foreign capital allowance. So anything exceeding those limits would be a special approval to SARB. And what that looks like is you documenting what you require from the Reserve Bank. So outlining the nature of any transaction that you're looking to do, similar to investing in a non-resident trust or an investment in your own name. And you'd actually need to put forward a motivational letter to the Reserve Bank with a valid AIT.
Okay. Sounds very complicated. I'm glad you guys are doing this.
We do a lot of those actually.
Yes.
It's really interesting.
What, special approval?
Yeah, and it's funny because they use the term special, but it's not really that. I mean, and we don't see it as, we don't have any declined, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And because they've now changed the regulation that allows South Africans to use a special approval directly into an offshore trust, whereas before they could only do a maximum of 11 million, it's now being used a little bit more. The only criteria then is on an annual basis, you've got to report on those funds. That's the only condition of that special approval. But as long as you provide source of funds and everything's above board, they really don't have an issue with it. And we're seeing that demand on those applications more and more.
But you've also still got a loan account against the trust to put that money in, right? So that from a state duty perspective, they can still see where the money is going. That's what they're worried about, right?
Exactly.
They don't want the money disappearing from the state duty.
Right.
Well, that's the idea of having just a more comprehensive look at the taxpayer's profile, and that's why the additional information is being asked for now. So yeah, I mean, SARS is aiming to just get that good view of your tax profile.
Fabulous. Okay. South Africans that live abroad, how do they move their money around? if their money's in South Africa?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we all know that there's more and more South Africans living all over the world. I mean, South Africans in general now global citizens, no longer just South African citizens. They kind of fall into two categories. One would be, have you done tax migration or have you not? And that's the conversation we're having a lot. I think it's quite a struggle in the wealth industry in South Africa for advisors to now navigate that dynamic where their clients are moving abroad. We've got a lot of scenarios where we have South Africans that have been living abroad for 20 years, they don't have a green barcoded ID anymore, they want to move money abroad. Maybe it's an inheritance they received, but they actually now have to do tax migration because they don't have a green barcoded ID to prove their residency for their allowances. So now they've got to cease their tax residency. What's interesting though in that space was what we've seen a lot of is touching on what Sephora was talking around on those AITs, those tax clearance applications. One of the additional requirements is stating your tax residency status when you do your application. So have you ceased your tax residency? Have you done tax migration or not? And you put your address in when you do that application. And as soon as your address is a foreign address, but you say you're a tax resident, they're then questioning the double taxation agreement with that specific jurisdiction. So when we're having these conversations in the wealth space, we're highly recommending that these clients find a specialist, a tax specialist in that jurisdiction that they live in to guide them through that double taxation agreement and get the right advice on what to do. Because for example, in the UK, from the day you become a tax resident there, you're expected, that double taxation agreement kicks in, whereas in Australia it's a 2-year period. So every jurisdiction is handled completely differently, but we're seeing this new AIT process is picking that up and the questions are coming forward. The inheritance space for us, we're seeing a lot more inheritance going abroad. Beneficiaries are all over the world and they're South African estates. And so this whole space around tax migration and your residency status is coming up more and more and more. And for us, it's actually, we're upskilling all our staff and making sure that they fully understand this because we're having to give a lot of guidance.
Yeah.
So it's quite an interesting space. But like Sephora is saying, these advancements in the SARS process has made other elements of what we do easier. An example of that would be in an inheritance scenario where you inherit an offshore asset. So let's say it's a unit trust offshore and you inherit it from your father. You used to have to do an application to Reserve Bank in order to put that asset in your own name. You don't have to do that anymore because SARS has viewability over everything. So as long as you now include it in your tax return, they're completely fine with that. So there's a lot of administration and reporting that's actually been removed because of the way that they're handling things going forward.
Wouldn't it be lovely if all organisations or SOEs in South Africa were run like the SARS?
Yes,
I
well,
mean,
right
agreed.
now.
Yeah, but I mean, it's amazing actually how impressive they've become in terms
Yes.
of making life easier.
Definitely.
100%, yeah.
Bring more taxpayers into the net as well, I'm guessing.
Yes.
but these are all good things.
Yes.
But it's clearly quite complicated. So your advice would be get some tax advice, is what I'm
Definitely,
hearing.
yeah. We're
Especially
actually
for someone who hasn't formally emigrated.
100%. And we ask that question a lot in the wealth space. Our wealth partners are asking us if we know anyone in those jurisdictions, which is quite challenging because recommending someone is always putting your head on the block. But like I say, every jurisdiction is different. So you actually need to have a partner in that space where your clients are that can help them in that country. But talking about SARS efficiency, it's not just in this space that we're seeing it. For businesses themselves, importing and exporting genuinely is becoming more and more efficient, which has a bigger impact on banking, on everything, which has been really good to see.
Some good news for a change.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Thanks very much, you two. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanne.